Hello class, we are in module 3 of class this semester. I cannot emphasize enough how important this particular chapter is, chapter 3 of your course textbook. What it does is it gives you a framework for policy analysis, and frequently I will be asking you to use a framework to evaluate social welfare policy. The framework I'll be referring to is Karger and Stoesz. Basically, that's the framework that's going to be used in this book. We have various frameworks, but for your purpose for this class, it's going to be Karger and Stoesz. A framework is almost like a logic model that helps you think through a social welfare problem and how you get able to plug in whatever the problem that you are facing. I'm going to be explaining that as we move forward. So, today's learning objectives are 5 key areas that you need to learn. 1. Understand the usefulness of a frame of policy analysis. In other words, why do we use a framework to analyze social welfare policy? You need to understand that, the importance of that. 2. Analyze the factors contributing to the viability of policy proposal. In other words, if we have to have an effective, efficient policy, what are those factors that we need to have in place to make sure that the policy is efficient or effective? 3. Explore how to determine the feasibility of a policy proposal. The bullet number 3 basically tells you how do you determine whether it is feasible to do A versus B. Now, as we are going to go forward, you are going to be reminded that the way you evaluate feasibility, we are going to look at political feasibility. Is the political climate okay? We are going to evaluate economic feasibility. Can we afford it? We are going to evaluate administrative feasibility. After you have passed the policy or an act, do you have resources, personnel, and all these other people in order to administrate? All those things that are important for policy to be implemented effectively, you have to know how they apply. 4. Gain exposure to a variety of resources critical to policy analysis. Now, when we are talking about resources, we are talking about resources in terms of just the money, the personnel, the expertise, all those things that you need to make sure that any policy is effective. And finally, learn to identify and utilize elements in a policy analysis framework. Now, we are going to be looking forward to see what are those elements in the policy analysis framework that are critical. So, what is policy analysis? And I think this is important for you to understand, because if you cannot understand what it is, if you can't define what it is, then you cannot do it. Well, according to Dunn, a policy analysis is a process of multidisciplinary inquiry designed to create, critically assess, and communicate information that's useful in understanding and improving policies. What does that mean? One thing, let's break this down. Multidisciplinary, it means that you involve expertise from different disciplines. For example, policy, you may bring in economists, sociologists, social workers, mathematics, engineering. Bring them, everybody at the table. And you bring them to create that policy, and also to assess, in other words, to evaluate how that policy is going to work, given the expertise. And lastly, to communicate in a very vivid way that information so that it can be understandable. So understand how that policy is defined is very important. Now, the policy making process, there are 5 important steps that you need to know. These steps are sometimes called stages of heuristic or heuristic stages. One thing that you need to know is that you identify a policy problem. In other words, throughout this semester, I will be asking you to identify a social problem or a human condition that requires some action. Remember last week we defined what policy is, something that an action or inaction, that's policy. So it's, you identify a problem. 2, formulate policy proposals. In other words, you formulate what goals you need to see or to achieve for this policy. 3, legitimize public policy. In other words, for legitimization of public policy, basically you are giving it the tools in order for it to be recognized. One way of legitimizing public policy is to be passed in Congress, whether it's state house or the federal government, so that it becomes law. You are legitimizing it, you are making it official, you are making it legal. And then implementing public policy, in other words, once you make it legal, then you implement it, make sure that it's implemented. There's one thing passing policy, but it's another making sure that what goals were set are implemented, followed, etc. Can you imagine if we had a policy that you have to stop at a stop sign, but if there are no policemen and women to stop you if you cross the police, if you cross the traffic light, then you are not implementing it. And then finally, evaluate public policy. You need to evaluate whether you go back and find out if it's working or not working. So these are the 5 most important things. And when you look at the rubric that I have in the syllabus, basically that rubric follows these 5 examples. Now, for you who want to see things clearly in a picture, this is basically what we have just been talking about. On top here, we have social policy analysis. Basically, this is how you analyze policy. In other words, you look at, first of all, the history of that policy. And why is history important? History is important because if something has been done in the past and failed, why would you want to do it? But you can't know it failed unless you know that it was tried. So it's important all the time to go back to history and basically document what has been happening through the history of that policy, whether there were several amendments, why were those amendments made, etc., etc. So I'll require you to examine the history of every policy that you're going to be looking at it, because history is part of an important element in it. The second piece of these logic models, if you speak, is look at the problems that necessitated that policy in the first place. What was happening at the time that a government or an institution decided to create a policy around that? So problem area is also very important. For example, if you are working on Section 8 of the Housing Act of 1937, for example, this act authorized payment of rental housing assistance to landlords. You need to know why was that necessary. Obviously, there's that information that you need to give. So for every policy, understand the problems that were there at the time that necessitated that policy to be created in the first place. Third, policy description. Now, there's a difference between policy description and problems that necessitated the policy. Sometimes students confuse the two. Policy description is basically the nuts and bolts of what the policy does. In other words, the policy has goals, it has objectives. Try to figure out what are those descriptions. Describe what policy said it was going to do, or what is described that the policy is going to do. It's a very important step because you cannot analyze a policy if you didn't know what it was said to do in the first place. Those goals are very important. They are the goals which are going to be the measures that you are going to use or parameters to evaluate whether it's working or not working. And then finally, this is the most important stage of policy analysis, and therefore it's called policy analysis. So you look at the policy goals, see what were there, right? And those goals, were they politically feasible? In other words, if it was in the US Congress, were the two parties, the most prominent parties are Republicans and Democrats, were those two parties, did they vote for it? If they voted for it, how many were Democrats? How many were Republicans? That's political feasibility. Economic feasibility, meaning that if the policy was enacted, was it given the necessary funding for it to carry on or to do or to achieve the goals that were supposed to be done. And then administratively, administrative feasibility means that were people available or in place to do what the policy was set to do or to carry it forward. So basically this slide is a recap of what I was talking to you earlier. Historical background of the policy, the problem that necessitates the policy. In this case, you are examining what led to the creation of that policy in the first place. Policy description is a detailed explanation of that particular policy, as I've explained before. And this is a most important statement. You need to understand the reasons for the policy before challenging or changing it. I think that is a recall question in your examination. Just remember that will be the answer. So how do we assess viability of a policy? We assess viability of a policy by looking at political feasibility. And in that case, political feasibility, you're talking about a subjective assessment. You know, if you have a political leaning towards the right, you will see things in that prism. If you have political leaning towards the east, the left, you're going to see it in that prism. Economic feasibility, as I said before, is that it requires a form of direct or indirect funding. In other words, sometimes the government funds programs directly, or sometimes it doesn't fund them directly. Essentially, however, a good policy benefits at least one person without hurting anyone else. I think in our last week's segment, we call that Pareto efficiency. You know, how do you benefit one person without hurting another person? I give you an example of single mothers and absentee fathers. If a single mother, rightly so, is supposed to get child support from an absentee father, and now the absentee father he works, gets a paycheck and pays that support. How about if that money, is being denied his current family? That is that a policy that is effective? Is he hurting his present family while benefiting his absentee family that's not there? So you have to weigh those things and weigh them very carefully when you're making those decisions. Continuing with the viability assessment, I said before, administratively, basically we are talking about who is concerned with the administrative viability of a policy. And a good example is that a well-financed and organized groups are likely to oppose adoption of the policy. So make sure you highlight how effective and efficient your ideas is. The point I'm making there is that if one group is opposed to a policy, for example, if a conservative group is opposed to a policy for whatever reason, maybe it's not fiscally good, but if you highlight that it's effective and efficient, it saves money, maybe you'll convince them. And talking about convincing, there is this video that I want you to listen to. It's an advocacy video by Fizzy Lizzy before New York State Congress, and she's trying to explain about her product. Read it, listen to it, and contribute for the question that I've given you. I've given. In other words, I want you to listen to Fizzy Lizzy, test me below, and then answer this question. What best practices did she employ in her advocacy? Discuss the group on Blackboard. So policy analysis engages a systematic analysis of how the policy was done in the first place. The key operative word there is systematic. It examines the goals. For example, analysis must understand the value premises of the policy. I have given here an example that I think is a question in the book, which is public perceptions, e.g. 40% of eligible SNAP potential recipients do not participate. In other words, people who are supposed to receive this supplementary food do not receive it. Why don't they not receive it? Obviously, the answer is public perception. The policy goals serve as the guiding principle for systematic policy analysis. Why? Why does it serve as a guiding principle for systematic policy analysis? Well, the answer is that it gives you a framework, a logical framework of how to assess and analyze policy. Ultimately, however, an effective policy framework evaluates the congruence of a policy with the mission and goals of the social welfare state. I think that's also another recall question in your examination, that there must be some congruence between what the goals are and the mission of that organization or the mission of that state government. Researching and analyzing social policy assessments. Students tasked with policy analysis, and that's very important for you to understand, will face two major hurdles. And this is what you're going to face when you're analyzing your policy. One, you finding and focusing on a manageable social policy. Sometimes social policy has been in existence for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and there's a lot of information. How do you manage this information in just few weeks of semester? For example, if you are analyzing Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obamacare, you cannot pick up the whole policy and analyze, in a few weeks that you have here. Perhaps the best approach would be, I'm going to look at X aspect of the policy. It could be what the policy says of ensuring children under 21 years. That would be one way of how to look at it. Or two, you can say, well, the Affordable Care Act has mental health parity. I just want to look at that mental health parity. That would be another way of looking at it. Or I could say, well, I'm going to look at the pre-existing component of the policy. So you understand that, so that it's manageable, it's efficient, it's a better way of how to do that. And then the second problem that you're going to face as a student is that finding generic information relevant to it. We have, in the era of internet and information, we are bombarded with information. I would guide you, I'll ask you to go to the library. The librarians, and especially Dr. Kilgo, has been working with my students over time. Instead of waiting the last minute, right now, if you have selected a topic of interest, go to them, ask them, how do I search for resources? How do I figure out what's the best information I need to address this assignment? So start early to go and be beneficial to you. Again, as I said earlier before, is that social policy research and the internet have become, big things. It's easier, it's more efficient, even more fun. It's more fun. We can recruit subjects, we can collect data online, we can do quantitative data online, but again, with more information, it just creates more problems. So understand whether policy is working or not. It's simply pay and go. I think there's another recall question which is asking you, what do we mean by pay go? The pay go in your book refers to taking money from one program to pay another program. For example, if you're taking money from, let's say, the food stamps, and you are paying, for example, Social Security, I'm just giving an example, that's pay go program. So you understand what that means. Well, here basically is a slide asking you to think about, where did we come from? How have we come here? What are these ideas and thoughts? Where do they come from? So when you have read sociology, you are going to look at the ideas of Plato. I would like you to go and read Plato and the Allegory of the Cave And here how he explains these people who have been in the cave all their time in the cave, and then they realize that are they what they are seeing, is it true or not? Until the philosopher king walks out of that cave and he sees that what they are seeing is only images. Read about that because it gives you understanding about the complexities of how public policy works. When you look at the work of Thomas Hobbes, he came up with the idea of the right of individual and the natural equality of all men. Politics and policy is about, debating. So the idea of individual, the rights of individual, we cannot value any policy if we don't believe that all individuals are created equal and they have natural inalienable rights as men. Those ideas were from Thomas Hobbes. How about the idea of John Rousseau? Rousseau came up with the concept of man was born free, that because man was born free, he should be able to allow to flourish so that he can be very innovative, he can be very creative. Well, the critique of Rousseau said, well, no, man was not born free. Man was born everywhere, tied on his mother through the umbilical cord. So we are not born free. So think about some of the chains that really chain human beings. The chain of drug abuse, the chain of violence, the chains of all those kind of things. Well, I'm sure that Rousseau was not thinking about those chains, but those are the ideas that you need to battle with. John Locke talks about the consciousness, the idea of tabula rasa, a blank slate. It's like at the time they discussed that when we are born blank slate. There's nothing written on our psyche. We don't know anything. Everything is blank. And so the environment basically writes what we now know. Is not totally true. Is that when you are born, we have have these messages from your parents, and if you're born by a mother who is an addict, most likely you're going to suffer those consequences. But you need to learn about those kind of things. This is basically an example of logical model, right? How you think through problems from left to right to evaluate what the problem is. In this case, I'm only asking you to use Karger and Stoesz model that I discussed earlier on. And finally, the choice of policy analysis framework. The social policy analysis is largely subjective. Analysis value system, ideological beliefs, and their particular understanding of the goals and purpose of social welfare. In other words, once you learn about this class, learn about the purpose of the goal of the policy, how the goals of policies are established or set, how they are evaluated, and how then do you determine whether it was a good policy or a good law or not a good law. So to recap, this is a very important class. Read chapter 3 of your textbook over and over again because everything about this class revolves around this particular chapter. Good luck, and I hope all is well for the week.